Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Hudson Institute. My name is Peter Rao. I'm a fellow here at Hudson, and welcome to our panel on the geostrategic ramifications of the crisis in Turkey. A point or two on the schedule. We're scheduled to go until 1:15. We'll have, after introductions, opening remarks by each of our panelists, and then at around 12:45, we'll open it up to the floor for questions. So to begin, since the founding of the Turkish Republic in 1923, this is the fifth coup. As all coups do, it came as somewhat of a surprise to observers of Turkish affairs, even if it was not a total shock. The media has given us much of the blow-by-blow, the TikTok, if you will, of the generating events of the coup, of the night of the coup, which it so happened took place on July 15th, the Ides of July. And we'd like to move into what the coup itself means for Turkish society and politics, what it says about Turkish society and politics, and perhaps most importantly, what it means for the West and for American and European security interests in the Middle East. Why is it important to have this discussion now? Well, quite obviously, there was the coup. But even more broadly, which is why we titled this panel, The Geostrategic Ramifications of the Crisis in Turkey, there are a broad set of trends in play, I think, in Turkey as sort of a scene setter before we get into the discussion. There is the good and maybe the not so good, the healthy trends in Turkish society and economy and politics, and some of its vulnerabilities. Much as Turkey is situated as a swing player between Europe and the Middle East, so too Turkey has trends that are desirable and undesirable. The good is that it boasts the largest middle class in the Middle East that powers an $800 billion economy, one of the 20 largest in the world. It is heavily integrated with the European Union. In fact, Germany is, by total volume, Turkey's largest trading partner. There's the Mercedes-Benz plant outside of Istanbul. South, across the Sea of Marmara in Bursa, there is the Bosch facility. Hugo Boss is in Izmir. Turkey, of course, is a member of NATO, and within NATO has the second largest army. Turkey is, at least in name, a constitutional democracy, and acts as an important transit player for Central Asian energy that flows from the pipeline at Baku across Anatolia to from the Caspian Sea to the Mediterranean to Ceyhan. So Turkey is important and undoubtedly a key country in American security considerations. But it also, as we know of late, has experienced some tumultuous events. First of all, it's located along the border with Syria, which it has a 500-mile border with. It's fighting a dual war, one against ISIS. Recall last month the bombing at the international terminal in Istanbul at the airport, and against the PKK, the Kurdish terrorist group that has plagued Turkey now for decades. Turkey's government is quite literally in a state of emergency, and purges have dominated worldwide headlines now for the last 10 days to 2 weeks. So to discuss Turkey's situation, the good, the bad, and the strategic implications of where Turkey sits today, we have three distinguished panelists, all from Hudson Institute. To my far left is Eric Brown. Eric is a senior fellow here at Hudson. He just returned recently from Turkey, one of his many trips to the region. And Eric is the co-editor of Hudson's journal, Current Trends in Islamist Ideology. He has, over the years, directed several research and analysis projects on the Middle East for the U.S. government, and is currently focusing on U.S. alliance building and maintenance in the greater Middle East from the Maghreb to the Asia subcontinent, which, of course, includes Turkey. To his right is Hillel Fradkin, who's a senior fellow here at Hudson. Hillel is a longtime scholar of classical contemporary Islam and has been tracking the general milieu from which the AKP has arisen for many years now. In fact, I was just reading some of his work earlier today, and I noticed that he said some years back that in Turkey, nationalist ideologies are giving way to the ideologies of Islamist inspiration. So I look forward to seeing if Hillel still thinks that's the case and what his take is on Turkish politics today. He, too, is on the masthead of Current Trends in Islamist Ideology. And to my immediate left is Craig Kennedy, a senior fellow here at Hudson. Before joining Hudson, he was for 18 years, starting in 1995, the president of the German Marshall Fund of the United States. And about a decade ago, he opened the Marshall Fund's office in Ankara. And at the time, the lead in one of the Wall Street Journal articles discussing the opening of the office was that Craig Kennedy, president of the German Marshall Fund of the United States, has a new passion of explaining the importance of Turkey to Europeans and Americans. So I hope that passion still exists today. And Craig, I'll let you lead us away.
Well, thank you so much, Peter. It's a real privilege to be with two people who know, frankly, a lot more about the subject than I do. Mine's a very kind of practical experience, having worked in Turkey in various ways over the past, I guess, 15 years. Most of the discussion around Washington starts out with something about the coup. But I think what's really interesting is that this botched coup has very quickly been overshadowed by an incredible seize of power by President Erdogan and his forces within Turkey. This current situation is the culmination of a long process that began a long time ago. Frankly, I think you could have seen the roots of it back when Erdogan was the mayor of Istanbul. And while he championed civilian control of the army, press freedom, and other liberal values, those were the things that I was passionate about explaining. He has also had a very strong authoritarian streak, almost from the beginning. I always tell the anecdote that I hosted him at a big conference with 3 or 4 U.S. senators in Istanbul in 2004, alongside the NATO summit. He gave this very reasonable, Western-oriented speech. Everything was very calm. And then a Turkish journalist asked what Erdogan considered an inappropriate question. And he went on a tirade where the translators stopped translating because they didn't want us to hear. But one of my Turkish neighbors turned to me and said, he just said that he hopes that someday we hang that journalist. Now, I think he was just joking that day. But there's always been this strong rhetoric. He has a very populist side to him that you've all seen. If you've seen the pictures of him standing on top of buses, which happens to be the favorite place for rallies for him, he has this rhetoric that is bound to ignite his followers. He's also famous for a quote that he made about 8 years ago when he said, "Democracy is like a train. When you get to your destination, you jump off." Well, he seems to have jumped off the train a bit early, since his destination, a more religiously dominated state, allied with similar states in the region, has not quite been achieved. Nonetheless, in the past 2.5 weeks, he's really proved his authoritarian bona fides. Military, he sacked thousands of officers, including the ones that are most experienced in fighting terrorism. Government agencies, education ministry, other ministries where Gülenis, the followers of Fethullah Gülen, who resides here in the United States, supposedly hold sway. He's gone through the judiciary, the universities, media. Yesterday, they rounded up 47 journalists, I believe, NGOs, and schools. Now, these actions will have major implications for the United States, and I'm going to leave it to my two colleagues to talk about that. But the consequences and challenges for Europe may be bigger and even more immediate. As you all remember, Angela Merkel famously, about less than a year ago, did a deal with Erdogan to stop the flow of refugees coming from the Middle East and elsewhere into Europe. And the deal was really simple. Erdogan was going to block the main land route into Europe, which would take people over to the European side of Turkey and then either into Bulgaria or Greece. And in return, Merkel, on behalf of Europe, unfortunately she didn't consult the rest of Europe about this, offered three things. One, money to take care of the refugee camps and other things as necessary in the billions of euros. Second, visa-free travel into Europe. And the third was the restart of EU accession talks. Well, Turkey's done its part. It reduced the flow tremendously, and it's pushed the refugee path out into the Mediterranean, which is both more difficult and where there can be interventions that can be much more effective than trying to track down people racing through the mountains of Bulgaria. Europe, strangely enough, hasn't done its part. It hasn't delivered the money. Yesterday, Erdogan at one of these rallies denounced Europe for basically reneging on their promises and asked, when am I going to see it? When am I going to see the money? But even more importantly, they really haven't moved at all on either the visa-free issue or the restart of the accession. Both of those are almost impossible given the actions he's taken. And what you're going to see is a real challenge now to how Turkey is going to relate to Europe. They're undoubtedly going to threaten to open up the spigot and start letting more refugees and others pass through the country. That will, in turn, create a crisis in Europe. The various terrorist acts over the last months, combined with just the impact of having 2.5 million refugees enter Europe, a place that doesn't absorb refugees with quite the same, energy as maybe some other places do, will really put everything on edge. There's a big north-south division in Europe. Most of the refugees ended up in either Germany or Sweden. Neither of those countries will take many more. So where you put them? On the other hand, the southern countries are all complaining that they're expected to do all the policing and checking and so forth, and they have no resources. And in fact, both the Greeks and Italians have turned to Merkel and said, you promised him 12 billion euros. Why don't you give us 5 billion to help us out on these little duties that we've been assigned? Germany in particular will go through a political crisis. This last week has been a very tough one there. And even though the polls show that Merkel has gained in political popularity, the fissures within her party and within the country have grown tremendously. More refugees will not help. And then finally, it's not clear how the rest of Europe will respond. There is no way you're going to give visa-free travel at this point to Turkey, given everything that's happened in recent months. So the negotiations with Erdogan will come down to how much money and maybe some other things that he wants from them. But there's also a bigger long-term issue that has already really bubbled up in Europe. Europe is built on the idea that liberal values are universal values, and Erdogan has shown that he completely disagrees with that sentiment. He is going to lead his democracy, as he put it one time, democracy is not a one-size sock. There's lots of variations of it, and I guess he's showing that he has plaid socks with strange sizes, but it's certainly not the socks that we wear here in the United States. You're going to see a battle over accession, and he's going to demand that more and more, not because he ever thinks that he's going to join Europe, but because it is his great rallying cry when he goes out and talks to his public. The Europeans don't want us. They've rejected us. That's why we have to find our own path. So I I'm going to be the maybe the most optimistic of the three panelists. I think we've got a horrible mess on our hands, and it's going to get much worse. And there's no really clear solution. On the other hand, I'd rather be in the position of the United States than being in the position of Angela Merkel in Germany.
Thanks, Greg. Hello.
Thanks very much, Peter. I'm just trying to figure out now exactly, since the standard you set for pessimism, well, how to get lower than that standard. But it does incline me to say the following before raising and trying to answer a couple of questions. And that is, it is I think this is both a situation which is very horrifying, but also very sad. I'm now speaking personally. I'm, as Peter mentioned, an historian of Islam, and have long been fascinated and impressed by Turkish history, both Ottoman and Republican. And this is if this is where those stories are ending, it's not a very, very pretty place. I wanted to raise and then address three issues, main issues. First, what is the meaning of the coup for Erdogan and Turkey? What is the meaning of the coup for the United States? And then, how might the coup oblige the U.S. to reconsider its Middle East strategy? So the first, what is the meaning of the coup for Erdogan and Turkey? Erdogan has called it a gift from heaven. And it is certainly a gift for him, although not, I fear, for Turkey. It has already given him a great deal, and he means to make it a gift that keeps on giving. What has it given him, and what will it give him? The first side of this is political. What Erdogan has wanted most on the political side, and he's been absolutely clear about this, is a transformation of the Turkish political system such that all power resides with him. This is both in terms of the form of the government, but also in terms of pronouncements he's made. And this was clear prior to the coup in a variety of particular initiatives, which I'll note a few, which will, I think, be familiar to many people here. First, initiatives to render the Turkish military no longer an independent factor in Turkish political life. Initiatives to compromise the independence of the judiciary and make it an instrument of his will. Initiatives to make all media subservient to his views. Prior to the coup, he had considerable success in all three, especially over, I would say, the period from roughly beginning in 2009, but especially accelerating after 2011. But he thought that full success would require a new constitution that would transform Turkey's government from a parliamentary system, the system it is ostensibly today, to what he has called a presidential system. The coup has brought him much closer to this objective and total domestic power. At present, Turkey is under emergency rule. Erdogan is effectively ruling by personal decree. They started issuing he started issuing decrees in consultation with the cabinet 2 or 3 days ago, and those have force of law. He is also in the process of removing all people from Turkish institutions whom he believes, whether he's got it right or not, oppose his will. These institutions include, of course, the military, the arrests that have been made of coup plot, the participants of the coup, and other people who are going to be charged with having been party to it. But they also include the following: all the branches of the administration of law, every one of them, courts, district attorneys, in our sense of the term, prosecutors, police, includes also the media, continuing a trend that existed before, as I mentioned, religious institutions, including the Ministry of Religious Affairs, but also imams that are assigned to this or that mosque throughout the country. Schools, a whole part of the school system has been essentially shuttered on the grounds that those schools belong to the Gulen movement. And the universities, all academics have been forbidden to travel outside of the country. All deans have resigned. Several, as of this morning, several university presidents had been fired or taken into custody. In addition to arresting thousands of people, he has sacked tens of thousands more. That's what I was describing before. He will now fill their places with his own people. As he put it in the case of the military 2 days ago, fresh blood. And that fresh blood will be blood that he can count on. As the diversity of institutions indicates, Erdogan is not only after the transformation of the political system, but of society as a whole. And this is also not new. He aims to create what he calls a new and quote-unquote great Turkey. And his vision for it derives from his own brand of Islamism. Now, where do we stand today? Presumably, Erdogan will try to push forward his constitutional project. That constitutional project, without going into the details, requires either a referendum or a parliamentary vote, and up till now, neither has seemed to be doable. But under flying high, so to speak, as he is now through the coup, he may be able to advance that in the technical ways that the present constitution requires. But in the meantime, he has already achieved his goal de facto through emergency rule. He is sole authority in the country. And although the declaration of de facto of emergency law has been for 3 months, he may, when 3 months are up, get an extension. I believe he cited the example of the French who have extended their emergency law several times since Bataclan. He has other levers, and I think this is also a very important aspect of what's going on in Turkey today and where it might be headed. One of the most important, it was important in the coup, but it continues, is the public mobilization of his supporters, whom he called into the streets the night of the coup. Okay, but is told to stay there, to demonstrate day after day, which can no longer be simply considered an obstacle to a coup, but is designed really to intimidate opponents and to lend support to his efforts. As part of this, he's also encouraged citizens to inform on their fellows, which will also intimidate people quite a lot. Many people have referred to his wholesale purges as a kind of witch hunt. But one should remember what he is after is a revolution, and before long it may look like a reign of terror. So what is the meaning of the coup for the U.S.? If for Erdogan the coup and its aftermath is a gift from heaven, for the U.S. it is a burden from hell. But I will take Craig's point, maybe more burdensome for the Europeans. For many years, Turkey has been called a critical ally. That is to say, an ally crucially important to American interest. And it often was so in the past. Among other things, it was a member of NATO and therefore played a crucial role in the Cold War, and it possessed, and still possesses, NATO's second largest army. Post-coup, American officials have continued to call it a critical ally. But today, that seems to me more like a prayer than a statement of fact. To be a critical ally means at least two things: the will to be helpful and the capacity to be so. And neither, it seems to me, is true today. Erdogan bears the U.S. ill will. Here, let me cite a little language, not from Erdogan, but from this morning's papers. Let me see if I can find it quickly. That expresses itself at the moment in the demand that the United States government extradite Fethullah Gulen. So the Prime Minister, Binali Yildirim, said this morning, he gave an interview with the Wall Street Journal, and it was reproduced in one of Erdogan's favorite papers, Sabah, this morning as well. He said as follows: "The evidence is crystal clear. We know the terrorist culprit responsible for vicious attacks against us and the Turkish people. We are heartbroken at the way that the U.S. has treated this matter. We simply cannot understand why the U.S. just can't hand over this individual." That's another way of saying they just can't understand the rule of law, their own and ours. I have no doubt that if they can produce evidence that's credible in a U.S. court of law, that the extradition request may be granted. But that's what they have to do. And there's a question whether they will be capable of that. But there will be consequences if we do not turn over Gulen, which were also described by the Prime Minister. America, okay, that's his standard of proof is we don't have to give you documents. That's not, you just have to take our word for it. I'm sorry to do things this way, but I think there's one crucial thing that's important. Okay, I guess I'll have to just try to remember it. Basically, what Yildirim went on to say was, if we don't turn him over, they will draw the conclusion that the U.S. is hostile to them, and they will not regard this as the behavior of an ally and will react accordingly. So that's the part that concerns goodwill. But then there's the part that concerns capacity. The capability of its armed forces for common purpose, it seems to me, is dubious. And this was beginning to become clear even before the coup. For example, right now there's an insurgency in southeast Turkey, which the Turkish army is fighting, not with particularly notable success. And as Craig was reminding us before, it's been a long time since the Turkish army operated outside of its own borders. It will be worse now because of the purges in the new purges in the army. One of the people who was removed was the commander of the Second Army, which is responsible for addressing the PKK insurgency. So, given that, my last question, and where I'll end, is how might the coup oblige the U.S. to reconsider its Middle East strategy? There are a lot of factors that may oblige a reconsideration. Some of them were highlighted in an event here yesterday, which I also recommend to anyone that's interested in the subject. Most generally, I would say the American Middle East strategy in the past was based upon a Middle East system of nation states. Some were allies, even friends, others were enemies. That framework, as is obvious to lots of people, is fast disappearing. The dominant framework of today's Middle East, at least as one saw from the discussion of Lebanon, Hezbollah, and Syria yesterday, is defined by the conflict between Sunnis and Shiites. And worse still, from a variety of perspectives, Iran and its radical Shiite allies are in the ascendant, and they are our enemies. In these circumstances, a strong and well-disposed Turkey might have been a truly critical ally. But it seems to me now impossible to count on it. And I would say further that regarding the threats that have been made, essentially threats that were made by Yildirim today and as before about breaking off relations or a much more hostile relation, I think it may well be that they don't expect to get Gulen. The proposal, the demand is win-win. If they get them, fine. If they don't, they have grounds for essentially breaking with us. And one sign that they think they may have another place to go is the fact that Erdogan is going to go to Russia next week or the week after next to meet with Putin. I would say also further the question of the EU accession. It occurs to me that that's another thing they're preparing to be able to publicly break with any pursuit of that, and that arose in the context of the claim of the demands that have been made in the street that the death penalty be restored to in Turkey. So Erdogan said at the rally where this was raised, well, if the parliament gives him a bill to restore the death penalty, I'll sign it. That, as everyone knows, means that they cannot join the EU on its. It violates a condition of EU membership to have the death penalty. So it may be that he's actually, this would make the break clean. He would be able to declare it as a matter of principle. It's not that you turned us down. We turn you down at this point. I'll stop there.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks. I'll probably end up reinforcing a lot of what Craig and Hillel had said, and I hope to not recover some of that ground, but rather to elaborate a little bit on some points that I think are very important. Anybody who looks at the map understands that the political future of Turkey affects the strategic construction of basically everything from the Persian Gulf to the center of Europe. And so what we're talking about today is obviously very consequential for world order as we've come to see it, as it's evolved over the last 80 years, and its future. We haven't yet really begun the debate in Washington because there's an enormous political uncertainty here in our own country over what our own future politics and our own future foreign policy should come to look like. I mean, after all, the Republican nominee for president is openly questioning the vitality and the importance and the utility of the NATO alliance going forward. There's a lot of uncertainty as well over whether Mrs. Clinton will govern like a traditional Truman Democrat who will invest heavily in alliances and see their strategic value or importance, or whether instead she will govern and pursue a policy in a very different direction. But while I think it's important that we begin to have a discussion now over who lost Turkey or where did this all go wrong, it's also very important to ask whether or not this relationship is salvageable, and if so, how, particularly because of the geostrategic importance of Turkey and of the bedrock sort of importance of the U.S. Turkey alliance going forward. So what we have now, as we've seen, is a breakaway faction in the Turkish army attempted to overthrow a democratically elected government, and in the process killed a lot of innocent civilians. And here in Washington, there's been a lot of reflections over already. There's been a lot of deep reflections over, well, why did this coup fail? And this has actually been a question that has sort of dominated the discussion. I don't think this is the right question. And I think, in fact, Turkey itself and the U.S. would be better served to ask, well, how can counter-coups be made to succeed? Because what is clear now is that Turkey will require a round of deep investment and nation building and state building in order to recover from this period. What we've seen in Turkey, the crisis has exposed deep fissures, a deeply polarized society, and a weakened state. The optimistic analysis has pointed to how the various major parties in Turkey, and not just AKP, has rallied behind the president. They came out into the streets to protest against this military coup. And indeed, all parties have come to embrace a basic principle of modern democratic and republican government, that military should be subordinated to civilian rule. This, it strikes me, as a real opportunity for a political leadership that would want to restore the Turkish Republic. But it's also clear right now that the political leaders in Ankara are not quite thinking this way. There would be a real opportunity in Turkey right now to address what has been, in a way, the fatal flaw of the modern Turkish Republic, and that's what it was founded on a very exclusivist notion of ethnicity, and there is a real opportunity now to expand that and to try to invite national reconciliation, among other things. But Erdogan has shown very little appetite for this project, and indeed he's shown very little lack of empathy for his various political opponents. It looks on many levels that he's actually exacerbating this polarization within Turkish society. He is, as we know, a very shrewd politician. I think at the end of the day, what makes him tick is his desire to acquire and to maintain power. And he's shown a capacity to turn on the dime over the last decade whenever it suits his own political purposes. He did this in 2008 when the bid to join Europe had lost a lot of its luster for a wide segment of the Turkish Republic because of the rolling financial crisis. He did this again in 2011 when Turkey noticed a huge opportunity in the region to refashion Turkey's relationships with a variety of countries that were racked by the Arab uprisings. And he wanted to create a new order, if you will, in the region, with Turkey at the center of that. When that effort to dominate the region from Turkey proved to fail, he's demonstrated a great capacity to purge members in his own party, including Davutoglu, and to basically blame them for the failures of the last few years of Turkish foreign policy. So there's been a view here that Erdogan may emerge from this coup much more powerful. But in fact, what we've seen is that he may actually emerge in a position where he's going to have much less resistance, much less of a check on his desire to pursue his own personal ambitions, and that he might actually, in the process, end up weakening the Turkish state. And this is going to bode very poorly for Turkey's capacity to deal with what are, I think, the core national security challenges which it's facing. The first is that it's not been commented on a lot, but to the extent that people in Washington are talking about the fight against ISIS, it's mostly talking about Syria and Iraq. But in fact, the ISIS movement has spread considerably into Turkey itself. And there's, in fact, some polling that has been done by an Ankara-based think tank called the Global Strategy and Policy Center, which found a significant portion of the Turkish population views ISIS as not a terrorist organization, but in fact as a legitimate state or country, and also as a caliphate. And this polling, the numbers are in fact quite staggering. It suggests that 7.4 million Turks disagree that ISIS is a terror group. Nearly 7 million people in Turkey believe ISIS is a state or a country, and of these, 4.8 million believe that ISIS is in fact the caliphate. Now, there's many different ways to gainsay polling like this, but what it certainly suggests is that there's a significant element in Turkish society that has mentally and spiritually detached itself from the republic, and as Hillel had said, also from the state-based system, which had been the bedrock of order in the Middle East for the last 80 to 100 years or so. And what's also true is that any political leadership in Ankara, if it wants to, assuming that it wants to address this problem, assuming that it sees this as a national security threat, will need a variety of state institutions, from the military to the religious institutions to the mosques, to the educational institutions, to be able to implement a whole of government and whole of society approach, to be able to roll up and to defeat the ideas which are animating the spread of ISIS. This is ISIS. This is to say nothing of Al-Qaeda and Jabhat al-Nusra, which, according to a variety of different Turkish analysts and politicians that I spoke to on my last trip there, is viewed with a much more lax perspective than ISIS is, in part because Jabhat al-Nusra was always seen as being an important Turkish proxy or potential ally in the struggle against Assad, as well as in the struggle against Kurdish forces. So the counter-coup and Erdogan's efforts to purge these various institutions of state are in fact weakening Turkey's defenses and its natural indigenous capabilities to be able to deal with the challenge that ISIS poses to it, both externally and internally. Beyond this, though, probably the larger and more serious challenge facing the future viability of the Turkish Republic is, in fact, the Kurdish issue, as was mentioned. Now, there's a view in Turkey, and it's also a view shared by a number of Washington analysts as well, that the war in the southeast was certainly triggered by radical elements within the Kurdish movement. It was certainly, the ceasefire was broken, and various radical elements, by attacking Turkish police forces, had resumed the fighting that has been ongoing. But then there's also, in addition to this, a view that this war has proven to be politically useful for Erdogan and for his effort to stitch together various elements of the Turkish ruling elite, that he's managed to use this war in order to hold elements of the MHP, which he's needed in order to pursue his own personal aggrandizement and the aggrandizement of his own ruling faction. He's obviously used this war as well to be able to bring the military back from the margins where the AKP had earlier relegated it, and now that the military is back, of course, he's begun to pay for this. I think one of the things that we'll find out in the future is that perhaps one of the things that had animated some of the rebels, some of the coup leaders, was a frustration over, in fact, Erdogan's policy in the southeast and the heavy-handedness of that policy. The policy itself, the strategy, in a way, is based upon a failure to read the dramatic changes that have taken place in Kurdish society over the last 20 years in the southeast. And it's also based upon a very short-sighted and myopic view of the future of the Turkish Republic. The population in the southeast is swelling. The population in the southeast is much more urbanized than it's been historically. This is not the rural, Maoist-based insurgency that the Turkish state needed to deal with in the 1980s. It's instead something much more politically sophisticated, something much more moderate, something much more interested in sort of engaging in a material and economic and commercial way with the Turkish Republic as it stands. It's very clear on the basis of the analysis that the only way to actually solve this rebellion is to try to find some sort of political settlement. And I've spoken to a number of people in Turkey who said that back in 2013 there was a review going on both in the government and a parallel review going on outside of government over how to take the ceasefire which had existed between the Turks and the Kurds and to institutionalize that and to try to enlarge that and to deepen it going forward. Many of the recommendations which had been proposed to the Erdogan government to find a political settlement, it turns out, had been rejected by him. And unfortunately, many Turks and many Kurds are paying the consequences of that right now. This raises a lot of questions, both in Turkey and here in the United States, about the future viability of the Turkish Republic. I've spoken to some Kurdish political leaders from Turkey who, among other things, said to me, "We certainly do hope for a political settlement with the Turkish state, but at the time being, that's not on offer. And insofar as we don't have one, we have other options. We have other options." And this, of course, doesn't bode well for Turkey's future stability, let alone its capacity to be a contributor to order. It also doesn't bode well for the future of the U.S. Turkey alliance, because at the end of the day, the U.S. Turkey alliance was based upon Turkey's capacity to be a contributor to the order in the Middle East. If not an active contributor to Middle Eastern order, then at least a strategic barrier between Middle Eastern disorder and the rest of the world. And now Turkey's capacity to act in both ways, it's been breaking down. And its capacity to actually be a useful ally to the United States and to others is being broken down insofar as it's increasingly itself becoming victim to or consumed by the various disorder that has racked other societies in the Middle East. So I'll end on that note, and back to you, Peter. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Eric. Let me invoke my moderator's privilege and ask each of you a question related to your remarks. I'll start with Craig. The night of the coup, I was walking past the White House, and I noticed that there were maybe 24 Turks gathered outside with Turkish flags and some television. At the same time, I was listening to German radio out of Berlin, and the reports out of Berlin was that the Tiergarten, the main park in Berlin, which is somewhat akin to Central Park in New York, was so packed with Turks that one couldn't get anywhere near the Brandenburg Gate, which suggested, and it occurred to me, that there's a whole dimension to German-Turkish relationships that aren't existent in the U.S. Turkish relationship, and that's the some 3 million Turks that live in Germany. And of course, Germany is, I think, the key player in the European-Turkish relationship. So, could you address what the dynamic is in the diplomatic relationship between Turkey and Germany that the Turkish population in Germany creates?
Well, it plays a very important role, and in several different ways. First, there's a set of I guess you'd call them assimilated Turks who have entered political life and play a very important role. One of the leaders of the Green Party, Cem Özdemir, is a good example. And there's one young guy who's really the voice of Kurdish Turks in Berlin, is now a member of the Bundestag and quite an outspoken force. Within the SPD, it's a very important faction that goes back to the days when so many of the mine workers in Essen and elsewhere came from Turkish immigrant backgrounds. But in some ways, the bigger story is the unassimilated, unintegrated part of Germany. You can still go to lots of neighborhoods in Berlin or Stuttgart or elsewhere, and you'll hear Turkish being spoken by people who've been born in Germany, who have lived there their whole lives. If you get on one of the flights, I think there's like 4 a day from Stuttgart to Istanbul, a lot of Turkish workers at Daimler, by the way. You actually think you're on a bus going to someplace in Anatolia. It has a very, it feels much more Turkish than it does German. Erdogan has played this in a very big way. He makes sure that there's Turkish television available in much of Germany. He goes there and he gives very strong populist speeches about respect for us, meaning Turks, to people that many of whom were born in Germany. He very controversially proposed, 3 or 4 years ago, creating a Turkish university in Germany. So, there is this internal tension. This is not, though, what causes the real fissures in Germany right now. It's much more the new crowd that is showing up from Syria and elsewhere. But the Turkish population does serve, in a way, the way any ethnic lobby in the United States might play. They have strong feelings. They want to see Turkey being treated fairly. When they do kind of cross policies, so for example, what was it, 6 weeks ago when the German Bundestag passed a resolution condemning Armenian genocide, 4 or 5 of the Turkish German members of the Bundestag voted for it, and at least 2 of them had to have police guards, still have them because there were death threats and so forth. But so it's a complicated situation. You certainly feel it when you're in a place like Berlin, and not just in Kreuzberg, but in Neukölln and other parts of Berlin. And it will be something in the back of Merkel's mind as she's trying to figure a way out of this mess.
Thanks. Hillel, you spoke at great length about Erdogan's failings and his weaknesses. I've also heard you speak passionately about the threat the Iranian axis poses to the U.S. and to the Western alliance system in the Middle East. Erdogan, despite all the issues you laid out domestically, has been pretty staunch in calling for a removal of Assad and a buffer zone in northern Syria and backed by a no-fly area. So do you think that it's within the capacity of the U.S., or do you think there's a tension between pushing back on Erdogan and at the same time building a counter-Iran strategy in the region? And then if I could just pivot off of that, because I think it's related to Eric, a lot of the American reporting and a lot of the news commentary has been about Erdogan's options in the wake of the coup as far as U.S. Turkish relations go. Denial of Incirlik, for example, is a way to try to bring about the extradition of Gulen. But what are the American options? What are the American policy, specific policy opportunities or policy options for trying to craft a regional order that is stable and healthy for U.S. interests? Hello, if you want to go first.
Okay. Look, on the question of Syria, I think it is true that it was one of the areas in which Erdogan was sensible in his proposal that a no-fly zone be established, that was both for humanitarian reasons, but also would protect substantial forces that were opposed to Assad. And he had, in that particular regard, he has grounds to complain about the fact that the United States was completely unwilling to do that. But that is now very much water over the dam. And it seems to me that he knows that, we know that, and it's a function of what is going on as we speak. The negotiations between Secretary of State Kerry and Foreign Minister Lavrov about settlement in Syria, and which preserves Assad. And already a couple of weeks ago, maybe it was 3 weeks ago, there were statements by Erdogan suggesting, or people within the government suggesting, that their view of Syria might be evolving, and I assume that has something to do with going off to see Putin on, I think it's August 9th, that's over as far as the Turks are concerned, unless we want to reopen it, and there is no inclination on the part of President administration to reopen it. So I don't see how being nice to Erdogan will help us in that regard, unless we change policies. What I would like to say, though, is that it bears the troubles that can come to them, to us, and so forth, and including with respect to the Iranian issues. By commenting on, I thought, a very important point that Eric made, which is that Erdogan has always wanted to be the master of his house. That he made clear. And I would say he is now the master of his house. The only problem is that that house looks a little damaged, and it's damaged internally for the reasons that Eric said. It's not clear that the prosecution of a war against the PKK in southeast Turkey will succeed. In which case, it's possible to imagine the partition of Turkey. I mean, it won't be by agreement. It's just that the southeast will separate. And it's also a problem because Erdogan has not only wanted to be the master of his own house, he has wanted to be a regional master. And as Eric also observed, he has been a huge failure at that. He could decide in the present circumstances, well, at least I got one of the two things. I can at least settle, I should be satisfied with Turkey. But he's not a man who settles. He's not always skillful, but he never, ever seems to forget what he wanted to accomplish. And there was a particularly striking example of that in the first 24 to 48 hours after the coup. I recall, I have to, in order to explain that moment, I have to say, remind people that 3 years ago there were major demonstrations. They weren't Gulen demonstrations, over a park in Istanbul called Gezi Park, which Erdogan wanted to convert into a building. He wanted to build a building there in the form of would be a replica of Ottoman barracks that used to stand on that spot. It wasn't going to be a barracks; it was going to be a shopping mall, but it was going to be a Disney shopping mall, so to speak. He got thwarted. And by the demonstrations, he managed to suppress them and so forth, but he didn't get to build his barracks. In the middle of the coup, among the things he declares he's going to do is get that barracks built. Now, when you think about it, this allegedly, the whole future of the country is up for grabs. This is not an obvious object of focus, but it was for him. And why was it for him? Because, I think, two things. One is because he hates to have his will thwarted in any regard, and because that building is important to his vision of what he thought where he wanted to take Turkey as a kind of recreation of a glorious past, of which that building is an important symbol for reasons I won't go into now, but it has a very specific historical significance. And that's what he's always got his mind on. The problem he has now is that externally he has shown no capacity to affect his will. Not in Syria, not with Iran, not with the Russians, not even with the Israelis. Maybe with the Egyptians. I know that's his serial enemies. So what is he going to do? And I think that this, lead it back around to your question, he's going to look for a way to at least look like he's making a grand play, and he will look for whoever allows him to appear that way. If it's us, so if we give him Gulen, he'll declare a major victory. Maybe he'll be a little bit more friendly. Unlikely, but maybe. But I think right now he thinks other people can help him more, the Russians and Iran.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks, Eric.
Yeah. I think over the long range, what we'd want to do is to figure out how to improve the prospects that Turkey can be reintegrated into the law-based order that the United States has invested an enormous amount diplomatically, economically, militarily since the end of World War II to build. On the flip side of that, we also have an interest in preparing for the possibility that the U.S. Turkey relationship is not salvageable. And we want to prepare for the possibility, though this clearly isn't a desirable situation, but we want to prepare for the possibility that there could be a breakdown of order in Turkey itself, and we need to seek to figure out how to both contain that and possibly limit the potential consequences and damages of that. I think to pursue both ends, we need to build up a lot more American strategic fortitude in the region. That is real staying power and real influence. And this needs to be happening at a time when the sort of post-1991 geopolitical settlement in Europe as well as in the Middle East has been breaking down and being challenged by a variety of different actors, mostly by Russia as well as by Iran. And so the first order of business, I think, is to answer those challenges and those pressures. And that means deepening what has started now under the Obama administration. That means deepening our commitment to hardening everything from the Baltics down to the Eastern Mediterranean, our allies there. Hardening them not just militarily, that is through a revitalized and reinvigorated NATO alliance, but also trying to figure out how to harden them politically and economically. We have enormous opportunities to build a sort of sub-regional security architecture in the Eastern Mediterranean, which would allow us to be able to potentially deal with any the continuing fallout in Syria, as well as at least create a more viable sub-regional order that should be attractive and should over time create a model for others to look toward. This also means that we have to think seriously about positions. We have to be very clear with the Turks that while their geography matters and that Incirlik obviously matters for maintaining tempo against ISIS in Syria and elsewhere, that we also have positions to fall back to. And that means that we should actively seek to build upon our relationships with the Jordanians, with the various Eastern Mediterranean countries that I mentioned, as well as with Iraq and with the Kurdish polity in northeastern Iraq. Those are countries which are desperate for our help, for our assistance, not just military assistance, but political and economic assistance. And now's the time to think very clearly about a long-term strategy to build them up and to bolster them over time. We have opportunities there. Our opportunities to do the same in Turkey have been greatly diminished as a consequence of Erdogan's leadership there. And we need to look at other options about how to build a more viable security architecture in the region. So that's how I would think about this to begin.
Thanks. All right. Well, I know I've deprived the audience of a lot of time to ask questions, but if we have a few, we'll start right there. Yeah. If you could introduce yourself too, please, and keep your questions short and direct them to somebody, that would be great. Thanks.
Hi, I'm Rebecca Ash. I'm a former intern at Hudson. I have a question for Hillel about Gulen. To me, it seems, Gulen is very much a straw man, that Erdogan is using him to sort of purge the government and do what he wishes to do. So why use Gulen at all? Why Gulen specifically? Maybe I don't know much about the history there, but why does he need to use Gulen to do this when it seems like he could do it very well without Gulen?
It's a good question, but Gulen occupies a special place in his universe. First of all, he was once a friend, or at least an ally, and one always feels especially bitter about friends one falls out with. But I think what he really blames him for is not this coup. In the first place, we'll see what kind of evidence the Turkish government, quote unquote evidence, comes up with to link Gulen personally to this coup. But I would be extremely surprised if there is anything that stands up. What he blames him for, and even there I'm not sure he was responsible, is for the coup of December 2013. And that when people in the judiciary, the prosecutor's office, brought charges against ministers in his cabinet and also people in his family, which he handled by firing everyone and getting rid of it. But that was in a way a more serious threat. I know it doesn't sound as serious as airplanes and tanks, but I think it was in fact a serious threat, and that's what he probably blames him for. And that's why he wants him. He either wants him on his terms, or he wants to be able to attack us for not having surrendered him. It's a win-win for him as he sees things.
Gentleman in the back.
My name is Rob. It's been my experience that, this is really more for Eric, that the State Department specifically did not, I mean, they were very well aware of all of the things brewing in Turkey over the last several years, but there has been, for whatever reason, an unwillingness to confront it head on early on. And I don't really see that becoming any different. So for whatever reason, because if we reward Erdogan, he's mad and he takes advantage. If we don't, he takes advantage. So going with your strategy of, kind of working on the perimeter to kind of put pressure, I mean, at some point you have to address the bull in the china shop. So what does that look like? When does that happen? And do you think that there is institutional political will within the government to do so?
Yeah, I mean, listen, there hasn't been much institutional and political will within the government, and the fish rots at the top. It rots from the head, and that we hope there will be much greater clarity in the next administration for addressing the bull in the china shop. I know for a fact that our political allies in Turkey, by which I mean liberals and in the broadest sense of the word, modern Republicans, have been grown increasingly despondent, and they've been weakened by our behavior particularly over the last 3 years since Gezi, when Erdogan unleashed this campaign of polarizing various peoples who have stood up against him, of attacking and excoriating and impugning their integrity and their commitment to the Republic. So if the United States doesn't reverse this, then I don't really expect any European leaders to do that and to defend these principles. And so that will be obviously a contributor. It will abet and facilitate Erdogan's own domestic power grab, and it will weaken our political allies in Turkey over time, and we'll have to live with the consequences of that. Worse, the Turks will have to live with the consequences of that. This obviously is an issue that needs to be addressed here at home. By the way, on the question about Gulen, I mean, everybody understands that Erdogan's secular and leftist opposition is weak and divided, and he understands that, and he's mastered the various instruments to keep them off foot and to keep them divided. Where he faces a real challenge is on the right, by which I mean both the political right as well as the religious right. Washington has made a lot of fuss in recent weeks about the so-called the personal dispute between Gulen and Erdogan. But at the end of the day, the dispute between, I think, Hizmet and the Erdogan faction within AKP is also deeply ideological and deeply political. It's very clear that this is not to absolve some actors who are broadly affiliated with the Hizmet movement from their alleged involvements in Ergenekon and some of the other political scandals which have racked Turkey in recent years. I've specifically asked people involved in that movement, and they've said, we're sure that there are people within the movement who may have involved themselves in this, but they were not acting on direct orders from Pennsylvania, as Erdogan alleges. But the important thing to keep in mind is that particularly since 2013, but this goes back for a long way, the teachings that have come up through Hizmet and many Hizmet-affiliated religious intellectuals, deeply pious Muslim intellectuals in Turkey and elsewhere, are coming out in defense of national reconciliation with Kurds, reconciliation between pious Muslims and secularist Republicans in Turkey, talking about the importance of civic pluralism, about building a civil democracy. Erdogan faces a real threat from this argument for a man who partly has figured out how to derive political power from his capacity to use religious sentiment and to use religion to consolidate that political power. So that's what I think is actually at the crux of this effort on him to blame this current coup. It's at the core of this current effort to blame the current coup on Hizmet and on Gulen.
I would, if I can, second that in this regard. The one area in which Gulen competed with Erdogan, or the movement competes with him, is in education. And the Gulen movement has, or Hizmet has, a large number of private schools which are extremely popular because they are considered to be better. Erdogan tried to shut them down, I think a year or 15 months ago. He was blocked by the courts. He won't be blocked anymore. He's already closed them. And he withdrew the licenses of the 20,000 or so teachers that teach them. So, as Eric was saying, when you care about ideology, you care about education. And Gulen was a competitor in that regard.
All right, let's take two final questions, and then we'll this gentleman right here, and the gentleman in the back then afterwards.
Adam Turner with the Endowment for Middle East Truth. How does this affect the economy in Turkey, which I know has severe problems, an economic bubble?
Who knows? The lira is fallen. It's not a question is how, I think the real question for the Turkish economy is what confidence outside investors have in it. It requires, like most countries of its type of economy, requires its debt to be turned over, and or the question is whether the credit markets will be how they'll feel about what's going on. It's not helped by the fact. Maybe Erdogan will pull back, but one of the things he has campaigned on is the lowering of interest rates on Islamic and other grounds, and he's kind of permanently in a fight with the central bank about the interest rates. Well, Turkey cannot borrow money at 4%. It has to offer higher interest rates. And if he insists on this, his newfound power leads him to think he can also control the winds and the seas, he may also think he can control interest rates, in which case Turkey will suffer, I think, economically.
A big part of the economic success of Turkey is always driven by foreign investment and the willingness of European, American, Chinese companies to come in there and make significant investments, usually allied with one of the big industrial groups there. In the last 2 weeks, people close to the government have been basically making the argument that Erdogan's stronger, stability, good time to make investments there. But a lot of the analytical groups are making the opposite argument that we talked about earlier, that the country potentially could be unstable, and especially the parts of Anatolia that often get the biggest amount of investment. So you have groups like the Zorlu group that really have they're in the heartland of that area, and that's what I would watch over the next 3 or 4 months, announcements on foreign investment.
I would add one other thing that has often pulled his or Turkish, should I say, bacon out of the fire, where it was Gulf money. And they may be tempted now again to invest there. I mean, he may be trying to hold them up for that. In that, I'll go this way if you don't put up the money. But they're not exactly flush either at the moment, and so that recourse may be either diminished or closed.
All right, a very brief last question. Go ahead.
Yes, Edward Roeder from the Sunshine Press. In 1980, the presidential election saw kind of parallel moves by rump governments in Iran and in the United States. In the U.S., it was the out-of-power Reagan campaign that was making overtures towards Iran. In Iran, it was the out-of-power government of former Honcho Bani Sadr. And they both cut a deal which eventually ended, a part we know about, with the release of the hostages upon Reagan's inaugural, and not before. Do you see any possibility of this year some hocus-pocus spy versus spy games between factions in Turkey and factions in the United States, given the remarkable similarities between the statements of Erdogan and the statements of Donald Trump?
Eric? No.
I don't see that that either Hillary or the Donald have much of a play electorally with Turkey. There are other things that where it's more front and center. I mean, the Iran issues, Syria issues, and so forth. But Turkey, I don't think so.
All right, that's a hocus pocus is a great place to end. We can go back to watching the DNC coverage out of Philly. Thank you, everyone, for being here, and let's thank our panelists for their comments today.